Hello again. We're going to continue our discussion of migrant labor in South Africa, the need for migrant labor in South Africa. We just finished talking about the conflict in the diamond regions in which white workers insisted on being exempt from the kind of control that the mine owners placed on black workers, strip searching, living in closed compounds, living under terrible conditions, working under terrible conditions, being paid very little versus what the white workers got, white workers gaining supervisory positions, skilled worker positions, and such. In the gold fields of South Africa, a similar process went down, and I'm not going to go through the details on that. What I wanted to turn to now is African workers and how they tried to maneuver in this situation. African workers continually fought for their rights, and if they were defeated, they were only defeated in this quest for their rights in the face of a combined attack from both the owners, the mine owners, and the white mine workers. They were defeated by the white farmers and by the white bosses. So every element of white society works to undermine the African and push the African down to the bottom of a society. For example, black migrant workers in the Kimberley, the diamond fields in the mid-1870s, effectively carried out a strike for higher wages and were victorious in their struggle. Moreover, in the early period, Africans viewed migrant labor as offering positive short-term benefits that they could exploit. They could be paid well for a period of time and then leave and use the resources that they accumulated for their own ends. Young male migrants could more rapidly accumulate cash wealth from migrant labor than they could from in any other fashion. And they could use this wealth for example, buying a bride, or for buying cloth, or buying guns. But these were short-term gains, and they contradicted the basic goals of settler colonial society. Indeed, by the 1880s, colonial administrators imposed new taxes on Africans which had to be paid in cash. Whereas when, under the old way of life in Africa, if a harvest was weak, the taxes which were paid in crops, for example, were correspondingly reduced. But the taxes imposed by the colonists were unrelenting. Whether times were good, whether times were bad, you still had to pay the cash tax. Africans also sought to take advantage of the mineral revolution, the discovery of gold, the discovery of diamonds, by becoming farmers who sold crops to the mining towns of the diamond and gold region. By the turn of the century, however, it became apparent to the mine owners that these peasant farmers, these African farmers, in being successful, were serving as a bad example to other Africans, Africans who were needed to work in the mines. In other words, if I'm an African working in the mine, and I see these farmers, these African farmers, successfully raising and selling crops and becoming prosperous off of the mining regions, selling to the mining regions, then I, as that miner, am going to try to do the same thing as that farmer. I'm going to use the resources that I've accumulated by working in the mines to buy a little piece of land for myself and take up the same path as these successful farmers. But that undermines the control that the miners have over black migrant labor, African migrant labor. On the other hand, the white farmers, seeing the success of these African farmers, want to get rid of that African farming competition and take that trade for themselves. By the end of the century, the combined interests of both the white farmers and the mine owners successfully pushed through legislation in the colonial government that made it more and more difficult for the African farmers to continue their work. Ultimately, they were driven from the field entirely, and the field was left only to the white farmers. In the Native Lands Act of 1913, the Union of South Africa barred African ownership of land or leasing of land anywhere outside of very carefully defined and limited native, quote-unquote, native reserves. Initially, these reserves were marked out as only 7% of the land base of southern Africa. And even when that number was increased, it was only increased to about 14% of the land base of South Africa. And when you're talking about the South African population, the African population versus the white population, you're talking about something like 20 to 1. There are 20 times as many Africans as white people, and yet the Africans only have a tiny fraction. Even at its maximum, the legislation of 1936 puts it at about 1/7 of what the land available to white people. This pushing of Africans off it isn't really pushing Africans off the land, is it? It's pushing Africans off of ownership of the land. Africans remain on the land, but they remain in a role essential to white farmers. They work as sharecroppers. White farmers, especially the smaller white farmers who lacked capital necessary for the purchase of farm machinery, especially used sharecroppers as a means of labor for their fields. And as sharecropping in the United States in the same time, sharecropping in South Africa was really a form of debt peonage. What debt peonage means is that really the more you work, the more you owe. You work, and you wind up at the end of the harvest owing more money than you've gained from the harvest. And the process starts over the next year, and you're more deeply in debt the next year than you had been the previous year. And it is by this means, that these small farmers could successfully operate their farms in the absence of a capital. With this, I'm going to conclude this section, and we will come back and finish up our discussion of South Africa settler colony in the next.